Mulai aja ya. Thank you so much for attending this maybe quick announcement as well. Then what I think it's really appreciate that this is the first time that we collaborate anthropology and international studies. I think this is something that's encouraging. Saya mau kenalin sedikit my colleague Emily. Thank you, Emily. I feel a little bit guilty because she's just arrived last night, and she's very active also with what happened in the U.S. with the politics, about they call her Senate, what should be, that's important in this time in the U.S. I really appreciate. Now, one thing that I think I would like to introduce Emily. Emily is my colleague at Berkeley. We have a different department, but we collaborate. We intersect with our courses and discussion, things like that. And during I did my dissertation, we form a group of 5, and Emily is part of that group.
Same advisor.
Yeah, same advisor too. So at Berkeley is so, and Emily focus on China. Is really research on Tibet. Yeah? So if you ask about China, she's one of the experts, and she's a professor at the geography Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder. And last year, she is the president of American Association of Geography. I almost met her at New York,
Yes, canceled.
but canceled because of it. So, unfortunately. So anyway, so I'm surprised when she's moved her research to Indonesia, because very difficult now to do research in China. But I think it's an advantage for us, because now she can research on influence of China to Indonesia through research on one of the research that she's now beginning is about in Eastern Indonesia, and her main research is about the power, political economy, and cultural politics in the nature of society and relationship, and she used ethnographic methods. So I'm welcoming you to Indonesia, and I'll give you time. Dia tanya berapa lama mau ini. So anyway.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. First, yeah, it's great to reconnect with Soraya after so long. Saya tidak bisa berbicara bahasa Indonesia dengan lancar karena itu saya harus berbicara English. I'm sorry. I'm also really. Oh, do you need it, or can you hear it?
No,
no, you need that. I need it. Okay. Yeah, I'm also really jet lagged, so yes. I apologize. So we thought a good topic for today to bring together different audiences might be just talking about climate justice at different scales, and that's something that can bring together some of my past research into that, as well as some of my new research that I'm starting in Indonesia. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about what I understand climate justice to be. And then I will talk about some, I think, very familiar examples to all of you of injustice in kind of distributive injustice at the national scale, looking at the climate negotiations, the COPs. So I'll talk a little bit about COP27, when the Loss and Damage Fund was negotiated. And then I'll turn to what gets obscured or lost in that national scale, which is regional and local injustices, and I'll use Tibetan herders and also geothermal in Flores as examples of injustice in adaptation as well as mitigation. And then I hope we have some time for discussion. So just what do I mean when I say climate justice? In the United States, the term really comes out of environmental justice. And that was a movement that in the US, of course, began in the 1980s, when people started to show that in order to really confront environmental problems, the environmental movement had to start paying attention to how those problems really shape the lives of some social groups more than others. And they argued that, of course, the mainstream environmental movement had, ignored the fact that the most vulnerable and marginalized groups bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens. And so climate justice is sort of taking those principles of environmental justice to thinking about climate change broadly. Theorists of justice, they argue that there's many kinds of justice. The most common way we talk about it, which I'll start with, as well as distributive justice, but also procedural and recognition, and also compensatory or ontological justice, I argue, are important as well. So of course, if we had distributive justice, that would mean that equity in the allocation of benefits from burning greenhouse gases would be equitable, as would harms from climate change. But of course, we all know, it's been very well established now, that the harms from anthropogenic climate change, whether rapid events like hurricanes, floods, or fires, or more slow forms of violence like sea level rise, declining water quality, are disproportionately experienced by those who contribute the least to emissions, and that those same groups who contribute the least suffer the most and have the fewest political, economic, and social resources to adapt. And so climate change basically exacerbates these underlying inequities and development gaps, putting a disproportionate burden on the poor and vulnerable. So again, mostly we talk about distributive justice, but procedural justice would mean that poor, marginalized, and vulnerable people can equitably participate in shaping decisions about climate change, and recognition justice would mean social groups are recognized rather than ignored based on their particular identities and interests. So let me just give you an example from my past research on injustice in terms of impacts of climate change. So Tibetan herders have contributed very little to climate change. They are some of the most economically, politically, socially marginalized people in China. But here's some of the impacts from oops, let me do this. Ooh, no, really far. Okay. Well, okay. I don't know why that part there. Anyway, yeah. Oh. It says impact of climate change on herders. I can't even see the bar.
You cannot click that.
Oh wait.
It's not showing yes. On the screen.
Oh no. All right. Well, maybe that's good enough. So some of the research I've done in the past has been looking at what kinds of impacts climate change has had on herders. One, there's increased vulnerability to extreme weather events. In their case, that means livestock loss from snowstorms. So yeah, more snowstorms and less ability to cope with those snowstorms. We also see expansion of inland lakes that are saline. We see a decreased availability of caterpillar fungus, which is a medicinal that's very important to people's livelihoods. And we see a number of detrimental ecological impacts. So my colleagues and I have studied both the ecology and herders' perceptions of what's happening to the environment, and they match quite well. So we have less medicinal quality, later green up, lower weight and size of livestock as a result of grassland degradation. And it's important, some of my past research has been about the fact that like the rangeland degradation and also the increase of vulnerability to livestock loss are about climate change, but not about climate change itself. Climate change, of course, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Climate change rather is a multiplier of ongoing social and political processes. And so in this case, a lot of the government policies to change property rights, privatize use rights, put up fencing, and other policies too have really decreased people's ability to cope with climate change, and also led to grassland degradation along with climate change. So I think from a justice perspective, it's important to remember it's not climate change itself, but the way it intersects and kind of articulates with social and political processes. So just an example of one of many, many examples of injustice, right? People who are, and the Tibetan Plateau is especially sensitive to climate change and warming faster than the global average. Okay, so going back to the national scale, I'll just run through a few figures. So here we see the top 6 annual emitters. This is from 2022. So of course we have China, which overtook the US in 2006 for 2007. Of course, during a lot of the time it was growing, it was also the sort of workshop of the world, producing a lot of goods that are actually consumed in Western countries. And so there's this question of how accounting should happen. And then the other 6, of course, US, India, EU, Russia, and Japan. But if we start to look at cumulative emissions instead, right, and that's what actually leads to climate change. It's like the total amount of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere. The US is still far and away the biggest emitter, most responsible for climate change. And here we see Indonesia moves up in the list, and it's because of land use emissions rather than greenhouse gas, rather than fossil fuels. Of course, another way to think about equity would be on a per capita basis, right? And here we see that US, Australia, Canada, United Arab Emirates, Mongolia is kind of an exception there, all have quite a bit more than, say, China, but China has, and they have more than 100 times the emissions of many countries in Africa in particular. And then the inverse of that is, of course, vulnerability, right? So many of the countries that are most responsible are also least vulnerable, and vice versa. We can also think about how to distribute the remaining carbon budget. So that is how much more carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases can be emitted to keep global average temperature rise under a certain amount. This graph is from 2022, so it's already outdated. On the left, you see the total historical emissions from different regions of the world. And in the middle, you see how much was left in 2022 to avoid 1.5. By now it's pretty much clear that we're going to overshoot at 1.5. Like 1.5 is really is going to be exceeded. And then the remaining is the one on the right is 2 degrees. And of course, we can see that what is left is far less than has been emitted to date. And so the thought exercise is like, how should those remain once distributed? However, since the 1990s, many countries around the world have gotten wealthier, but have also gotten much more unequal. So around 1990, more than 60% of global inequality in individual carbon emissions was due to differences between countries. But by 2019, the situation was reversed. And so now more than 60% of inequality in emissions is due to inequality within countries. That is the wealth gap and the resultant kind of emissions gap has increased a lot, right? So what does the distributional picture look like if rather than looking at the nation state, we look at just sort of wealth, individual wealth? This is a little bit outdated, but still a famous graph that shows that between 1990 and 2015, the wealthiest 10% of the global population was responsible for almost half of total emissions growth, whereas the poorest 50% were responsible for only 6%. And here's just some other ways to visualize this. The bottom 50% of the population in terms of wealth contributes only 12% of global emissions, but is exposed to 75% relative income loss and has very little capacity to finance adaptation. And this is just another similar one showing, the top 1% has emitted almost 70% of emissions. There's also another way of looking at the issue, which is kind of interesting. Like in the US, we tend to think about the carbon footprint and yourself as an individual, but some geographers have pointed out that the carbon footprint was invented by oil companies to make us think of ourselves as individuals, right? And that if you think about individual consumers, it's a massive problem because there's so many people. But if you think about the producers, there's actually a very small number of players who are responsible for most carbon emissions. So one analysis showed that, this analysis shows that more than a third of global carbon emissions from fossil fuels and cement over the past 50 years can be traced to just 20 companies, mostly oil and gas. And 2/3 of emissions originated in 90 companies, and those include state-owned companies as well, right? So we shift the frame, right? We might, have something like a better handle on the problem. And as I talk about all this, I'm sorry about the things. Anyway, we're doing a terrible job. All right, so let me turn to international climate negotiations. So the UNFCCC, of course, you all know, is a multilateral treaty opened signatures in 1992, and they have annual conference negotiations called the COPs, or the Conference of the Parties. Of course, since the treaty was signed, greenhouse gas emissions have just continued to go up even more rapidly, from about 360 parts per million to over 440 parts. One of the key principles of the UNFCCC is the common but differentiated responsibilities, which I'll refer to as CBDR. And that, of course, divides parties into industrialized and developing countries. Many people have called this the ethical anchor of the international climate regime and said that it constitutes an argument for distributive climate justice at the international scale, right? It says those who have historically contributed the least should not be responsible. This is one of the key sticking tensions in negotiations today, more than 30 years later, where some parties stick to the original definition of who is developed and who is developing, and say they do not bear responsibility. Others argue for, say that country obligations should be based on luxury emissions and not survival emissions. Of course, how you draw that line would be very difficult. Now, the like-minded developing countries, or LMDC, which includes China as well as Indonesia, has been a significant advocate for common but differentiated responsibilities at the COP negotiations. They really helped shape this as a North-South issue, and they sort of adhere to a very strict interpretation of historical responsibility. So China uses this to argue that it has no responsibilities and that it's still a developing country. Of course, many other people would say, in 1990, no doubt China was a developing country, but really that should fit the category now. So this is one of the keys. The advocacy of CBDR is really statist in that it emphasizes historical emissions at the nation state scale. And in the case of many LMDC countries, it's really to preserve fossil fuel reliant economies. And so at COP27, I argue that using CBDR discourse worked as a scalar tool to unify developing countries, but in a way that really marginalized the interest of low income and small island parties to the agreement. And I'll run through that argument here. So I had never been to one of these negotiations before. It was very interesting and strange to me. But so one of the things I learned is, because there are so many countries in the world, there's not enough time for everyone to speak once. let alone multiple times. And so this makes negotiating blocks really important. The biggest one in the yellow square is G77 plus China. Of course, there's way more than 77 countries. They almost always speak first. And then there is the LMDC, the like-minded developing countries, which again includes Indonesia, China, also Bolivia, Vietnam, Ecuador, India, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. It's kind of interesting because it brings together these countries that are otherwise quite like unfriendly towards each other, but they all negotiate together as a bloc. And what they were founded with the idea of being like-minded in sticking to the principle of CBDR, and it's become known for taking somewhat hardline positions, right? So it's rejected any deal that includes making different distinctions between other than developed and developing. Here's another visualization of the main groups. Here, the size of the circle represents the population represented by the coalition, and the thickness of the line represents how many countries the two groups have in common. So on the one hand, within G77 plus China, you have the LMDCs, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have the small island states or small island developing states, as well as the least developed countries. The small island and low-lying coastal nations really see climate change as an existential threat, so they lobby for the strongest measures to combat climate change. They want mitigation, not just adaptation. They've argued strongly for 1.5, whereas LMDC has argued against 1.5. And so this has caused them to forge some informal alliances with the EU and the Environmental Integrity Group. So before moving on, I want to make what might seem like a super obvious point, which is that all the parties and party groupings are nation states or supranational, like the EU. And this is important for one, because it limits the representations of indigenous peoples, right? The indigenous peoples can participate in the indigenous caucus, but they're only observers. They don't have a seat at the negotiating. And this forces indigenous peoples to rely on the states that they live in, even though the history of marginalization and discrimination by these states arguably undermines the legitimacy of their representation on behalf of the indigenous people. And so, part of our point here, or my point here, is that advocacy for climate change, climate justice by nation states is really no guarantee of what happens within those territorial borders. And this is an example of what scholars call procedural or participatory injustice. Okay, a little bit of some pictures of what it's like to go to a COP, because it's hard. Yeah, anyway. So if you attend a COP itself, you'll see the space is structured into two different areas. So you have a blue zone where you need a badge to get in, and then you have a green zone where it's sort of these off-site events. So in the blue zone are the negotiations, press, side events, exhibits, and country offices. Now, pavilions are where countries and other organizations can set up displays and meeting spaces. And over the years, kind of their number and importance has really grown. Pavilions are supposed to be available for every country, but the price is really exorbitant. So Bhutan, for example, a least developed country, had to pay $450,000 to have a pavilion, a tiny pavilion in Dubai. And several African states, really small pavilions, listed multiple corporate sponsors, including oil companies, right? Because they can't afford it. So another example of sort of representational or procedural. By contrast, the wealthy Gulf states have huge, gigantic spaces. Here's a picture of the China Pavilion from 2027 in Sharm el-Sheikh. That year, it was the only one I saw that had simultaneous translation available through the entire conference. The plenaries have simultaneous translation for all the UN languages, but the other types of sessions do not. And this lack of translation is also one of the ways in which smaller countries or non-English speaking countries are disadvantaged. So francophone countries in Africa, for example, where French might be a second language, or a third, English might be a third, or fourth language. And then, example of a Gulf state pavilion, UAE. There's lots of greenwashing with here's OPEC with their Brazilian, more and more fossil fuel representatives. At COP27, there were like 636 lobbyists from fossil fuel companies, and in Dubai, it quadrupled to almost 2,500, right? Bigger than any delegation other than Brazil. Okay, so what do the negotiating sessions look like? There's the plenary sessions, which are the big, formal, open to everyone, translated for everyone. And then there's informal meetings where people try to flesh out things on the agenda. And then where the real action happens is these informal informals or even huddles. Those are closed to observers. And so in terms of like ethnography of how these things work, the first week very few things happen, and then it gets down to the deadline time and everyone's freaking out. And so the informals start to work later and later, like they stay up till 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 6 a.m., which is, I think, is a kind of terrible way to get things done. Like, you're really sleep deprived. That's the decision. But there's also the issue of capacity and delegation bias. So again, an issue of justice, where big delegations, rich countries like the US or China can send huge numbers of people. They have, they can take turns, like go to sleep. They can be at every session. Whereas very small countries often don't have the financial capacity. They miss out on certain negotiating tracks. They can't stay up all night or be there all the time, right? And so that's an issue of procedural inequality. Also, these negotiations often run past the deadline. And so people have to like stay over a day, and small countries have really objected that they can't afford to like pay another night at the hotel or change their plane tickets and things like that, right? So again, there's some procedural inequity in this. So at COP27, the main focus was, of course, loss and damage. We can look back arguably and say that there's very little funding, but it's been a fight that's gone on for a long time, right? And loss and damage, of course, is different from adaptation. It is saying there are some things that we can't adapt to. There are some damages that we just have to be compensated for. And it's something that activists from the least developed countries have really argued for a long time. The US, of course, has been against it for a really long time because they argued that it's already covered by adaptation and they don't want legal liability. So I was observing the sessions at COP27 and they were getting nowhere, like usual, I guess. And then near the very end of the week, there was a session, it was coming to a close, the time allotted was already ending, it was about the cover text. And the EU negotiator stated at the very end that they would be willing to consider loss and damage under the condition that it would be directed at the most vulnerable countries from a wide funding base. Switzerland immediately followed, saying that they would be willing to look at it if it included keeping 1.5 alive, and if the fund included both private and public flows from, quote, all high-income countries. So this argument about high-income countries was understood immediately by LMDC as implicating them in climate finance. And so they rejected it immediately, right? And so that year, Bolivia was negotiating on behalf of this bloc, again, that Indonesia and China are both in. And he stated, quote, developed countries talk a lot, but in practice, they do very little. They promised a lot in Copenhagen in 2009. We're still waiting. They're shifting the burden to developing countries in the private sector. They're trying to shift CBDR. They're trying to ignore the basis of UNFCCC. They're bracketing equity in CBDR. So they tried to reject this particular version of loss damage. And then at another later negotiation, the Chinese negotiator objected to what he called the attempt to create distinctions among developing countries, stating, quote, since the Bonn session, some countries keep trying to use terms such as low emitters, medium emitters. This is attempting to damage the legal foundation of the Paris Agreement. On the other hand, of course, it's also true that many lower income and small island states do really want China to help pay for their adaptation and loss and damage. But this issue had to be subordinated in the interest of the larger bloc for loss and damage to be passed. Another issue was, for example, Barbados and other countries called for debt relief and reform of the multilateral aid system, but Chinese negotiators refused to have that on the agenda, of course, because they're like the biggest lender around the world, by saying that it's beyond the mandate of the process. Many negotiators from small island states also called for that the text should say that we need an unqualified phase out of fossil fuels. But the oil-producing Arab states, and again, countries like China, argued strongly against mentioning fossil at all. China said that this would be rewriting the Paris Agreement goals in terms of mentioning net zero. And of course, many, like China and the Arab countries, want to keep emitting fossil fuels. They just want to use carbon capture and storage, which is a very problematic so-called solution. What was interesting kind of ethnographically was that even though there were these like really obvious distinctions between the positions, whenever, you know, people from SIDS or the small island developing states or least developed countries spoke, they would discursively first align themselves with the G77 plus China position. And then they would go on to articulate what were actually some different positions. But there were no direct disagreements aired, right? The only direct disagreements were between, they would like, you know, argue that the US and the Western countries were not doing enough. So all this demonstrates that the discursive project for using, that the discursive project of using CBDR to achieve the loss and damage fund was a scalar project, right? So the interests of the small island states, least developed countries, were really subsumed within the broader interests of CBDR to the detriment of their own goals, and arguably for really climate change mitigation goals, right? They wanted more ambitious mitigation of greenhouse gas. National sovereignty was another key kind of discursive move that also cements the nation state, right, as the scale of interest. Of course, national sovereignty was important in the 1960s in fights around independence and colonization, and so it's seen as you know, an argument for justice along those lines. But the way it kind of plays out now is, you know, there were sort of debates about whether human rights should be included in the language of the text. And again, LMDC negotiators said that this was a matter of national sovereignty and that human rights was a distraction and not related to climate change. So it is. And so Bolivia, again, arguing that here on behalf of the LMDC, argued that, you know, he said the implementation should be based on full operationalization of equity in CBDR. And then he used that to immediately suggest eliminating the term climate justice, right? He said that this was not in Paris or Glasgow and so should not be included. So in the name of sovereignty and non-interference at the nation state scale, these countries really rejected the type of indigenous, local, regional claims to climate justice that they have no interest in addressing themselves. Right, so again, the point is that, you know, having nation states focus on national sovereignty as a principle of justice can work against having discussions of issues such as social justice or human rights that work within the nation state. And of course, I've already mentioned the issue of indigenous peoples not having participatory justice. And more generally, the nation state scale can obscure or translate into injustice at the subnational level due to these entrenched histories of inequality and marginalization. So I'll just turn to some examples now of that in terms of both adaptation and mitigation. So first, an example that I think is really interesting, not from my own research, but there's been quite a lot about this. So on the international level, Bangladesh is known as a champion for climate justice, right? For years, they've been a very important voice in climate negotiations. But within the country itself, sort of dystopic imaginaries of already ruined lands have justified the promotion of shrimp aquaculture as a form of climate adaptation. And that is something that agrarian social movements have actually been sort of struggling against for decades. So shrimp aquaculture was originally pushed as a form of development, but what it does is it dispossesses local people of land, right? Because it requires consolidation of land. So a lot of big landowners come and buy up all the land. There's fewer labor requirements than rice agriculture. So it pushes a lot of people to migrate to the cities. And then a lot of those people are said to be climate migrants, when really they're displaced from these processes of agrarian land possession. It also leads to salinization of the soil, which is also an effect of climate change. So some scholars have argued that some of the damages to the land that have been attributed to climate change are actually the result of shrimp aquaculture. And now both sort of so-called experts in terms of both the international community and some people within the country have called for shrimp aquaculture as a form of climate adaptation, when in fact it is doing the opposite, right? So again, it's been protested because it's really a vehicle for wealthy investors to dispossess the agrarian poor. But an imagination that sees a rural landscape as already ruined, that sees the future as being only in urban areas, has sort of pushed this so-called solution that is actually causing further social and ecological. So this would be an example of both distributive and procedural recognition of justice in adaptation. Another example comes from my own work in Tibet. So in Tibet, China's white papers on climate change and adaptation and its national climate adaptation strategy includes what they call ecological migration, which is supposedly resettling people away from areas that are ruined, again, not the case, as a form of climate adaptation. So this ecological migration policy was originally, it was sort of like, it had already been in place and then it got incorporated into the so-called climate adaptation strategy. It's implemented mostly in this area that is at the headwaters of the Yellow Yangtze and Mekong rivers. That area is considered important for the ecological security of the country. What they've done is resettle Tibetan herders to new housing complexes, like about 10,000 households, 55,000 people were resettled to these complexes that are very distant from where they originally lived, they have to sell their livestock, and it's supposed to be to protect the environment by removing grazing entirely. Now, some colleagues of mine have done some ecological work that really questions this idea that the way to restore grassland is to remove grazing entirely. These ecosystems co-evolved over millennia with grazers. And so basically what they showed is that that climate change is, not good for the grasslands, and moderate grazing is beneficial for alpine meadows, and that when you have grazing together with climate change, you actually mitigate some of the undesirable effects of climate warming. So this shows that actually removing herders entirely is maladaptive, not adaptive from an ecological perspective. And of course, there are very, very significant social and cultural dislocations, right? The government provides subsidies. These actually don't often reach people in time. They don't keep up with inflation. They have unexpected costs for fuel and food, which they used to just get from their grasslands. Many of the settlements are poorly built without sanitation infrastructure. Herding is a complex set of livelihood skills that people have, but in the city, they don't have the skills, language, and otherwise, and there's also a lot of discrimination. So people have not been able to get labor. And of course, kind of most importantly, it dispossesses people of ties to their territory, including sacred lakes, mountains, territorial deities. And so it's really an example of distributive as well as recognition and justice, right? This sort of take people away from their ancestral territories. So that's on the adaptation side. And of course, there's also numerous injustices in the so-called green transition with climate mitigation rather than adaptation. I say so-called because a lot of work has shown recently that, even though, renewables are, growing a lot, so is overall electricity consumption, right? So in the US, we have, I hate AI and crypto, and one of the many reasons is they're terrible for the environment. Like in the US, the growth of data centers for AI has kept a lot of coal-fired power plants open that would otherwise have been retired, and this is happening. And some people call this the Jevons paradox, where the more efficiency you just have overall growth. This is not a trans-historical paradox; it's a paradox of capitalism, really. So a lot of the work on solar, a lot of the work on the green transition has been on solar and wind. They both have very large land requirements. So many scholars are really framing the renewable question in terms of a new agrarian question, right? Whose land is the most valued? Which land is going to be grabbed for these new developments? So there have been a number of studies of solar plants in India. This is a picture of one. That have shown how the land dispossession proceeds. In India, there's a category called wastelands, and so even though many people actually use them, there's examples of declaration of land as waste, and then usually marginalized people, lower caste people who had used those lands for grazing, for example, lose access. There was one study that showed that also, like, these areas that were then enclosed were places for women to be able to socialize with each other. There's been quite a lot of work on wind energy in Mexico in particular, arguing that the way it's done is a form of colonial dispossession, right? Reinforcing injustice, including in the case of indigenous territories, the right for different ways of life and worldly practices to exist. And then, of course, there's the rush to mine lithium, particularly in Chile, and nickel, which you all know more about than me, to create green sacrifice, so that again, it perpetuates modification. So just a couple minutes on what I'm trying to work on now, which is on geothermal in Flores. And geothermal hasn't been as represented in the literature. And it's interesting because its spatiality is much more vertical rather than kind of horizontal. It shares a lot in terms of technology with oil and gas, so different set of issues. Indonesia, of course, has roughly 40% of the world's known geothermal reserves, but geothermal currently only accounts for about 3% of installed capacity. So given, of course, ongoing dominance of coal-fired power production in the context of the country's commitments to address climate change and also very slow adoption of renewables, the Indonesian state has pushed to rapidly expand geothermal electricity generation with ambitions to surpass the US in terms of installed capacity and become a quote-unquote geothermal superpower. So in this context, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources declared the island of Flores a geothermal island in 2017. It originally identified 18 and now 21 potential sites for development. Flores, of course, in addition to being poor economically, have very low rates of household and industrial electricity consumption, and there are still some households not connected to the grid. The grid right now is currently base loaded primarily by diesel and coal. So they're dirty, they're costly, and that's one of the main reasons for geothermal production. For rationales. But despite state enthusiasm and donor funding, the implementation of geothermal has been very, very slow due to community resistance. So like mining and other extraction projects, geothermal poses a threat of land dispossession, less surface land than solar and wind, but there's still land needed for access roads and well paths. But there's also, of course, concerns about induced seismicity, right? Earthquakes. There are well-known examples of lethal accidents from geothermal, hydrogen sulfide leaks. There's concerns about water pollution. And there's also been concerns about lack of transparency, where a company has gone in and said has said there won't be relocation, but then leaked documents have shown that actors would be relocated. And then this community resistance has in turn been often met by state violence and manipulation. So, so this is an example of a place a place called Lokasi, close to Bajawa, and it was an early attempt to drill geothermal before the current kind of push. There was an attempt to drill around 1998. It was a PLN in Japan project. The electricity production was not successful. They tried to cap the well, and then it sounds like some people know more about this than me, so please tell me afterwards. And then there were explosions, right? And so what has happened is that these paddy fields and cornfields have been ruined, and now other community, because of kind of networking amongst communities and activists, other people who are faced with geothermal know about them. So at the time, the drilling area got some compensation for their land, but the company claimed that this was natural, right? This had nothing to do with the drilling, even though nobody believed that. And so they have gotten no compensation. Some households have had to move. Rice fields were destroyed by the emergence of geothermal. And so this is some pictures of what former rice and cornfields look like now. Big Yellowstone. This is a current anyway, so you can see this is an actively cultivated cornfield, but new funerals for beds are showing up. So yeah. So that was right here. Okay, so this history of accidents and lack of compensation, fear of hydrogen sulfide leak, general unevenness in distribution of risks and benefits are some of the main reasons for opposition. Another reason is this issue of where the electricity is going to go, right? So the issue is, electricity use is low on Flores, and there are people without electricity, and it is diesel, which is not good. But of course, Indonesia has also prioritized the development of tourism in Labuan Bajo, near Komodo. First, it was one of the quote unquote 10 new Balis, and now it's one of 5 super priority tourism sites. Of course, in Labuan Bajo, this has led to rapidly growing consumer prices, growing economic control of livelihood opportunities by businessmen, mostly Java, and private enclosures of public beach areas, as well as other forms of dispossession. This tourism is one of the main reasons of growing electricity demand in Flores. Labuan Bajo's demand has grown 15% per year because of tourism, and every new large hotel that's built consumes between 500 kilowatts and 2 megawatts per year. And so again, local people are sort of saying, we don't want these geothermal plants because they're just fueling this tourism in Labuan Bajo, which is not benefiting us at all. And there's also a lot of histories of broken promises of electrification. So in a village near Ulambulan, which is one of the sort of oldest working geothermal plant, some villagers were promised back in 1983, when they first started considering it, that they would not use one of their fields and water sources, and that they would, because it was needed for the geothermal site, and that they would be given electricity in exchange. That was in 1983. They didn't use the site, but they didn't get grid electricity until 2019, right? Almost 30 years later. And there's still 4 village hamlets without electricity. Similarly, in Ende, there is a geothermal site in the village, and they were, and they didn't get grid electricity. There's some technical reasons for that, but for them, it's we're not benefiting. There's also, where the company is trying to acquire land, of course, they are really kind of tearing communities apart in their efforts to do so. They often, try to pay people for their land. The people who are willing to give up their land are usually those who have migrated elsewhere. They're not really using the land anymore, but people in the village say, you don't have the right to sell this land because it's on that land, it's communal, we need to have a process for deciding together. And so this is something I'm trying to learn more about. There's also promises of CSR, which is viewed as a development benefit by some, like getting new seeds and stuff, and other people see it as a form of manipulation. Threats of job loss for those who for those who have jobs who oppose. And so this has also led to a lot of inner community conflict within the villages where and there have been some resistance. This is from last October in Puchiliok, where villagers have tried to block PLN from entering the village. In response, of course, PLN and the government have brought in police and the army to repress dissent. As of last October, this village had like 27 clashes with the geothermal team and security forces. And in one incident in early October, 4 residents and the editor-in-chief of a local or of an independent news organization were being arrested. So my current project is trying to examine how activists and community members are articulating this idea of living space or ruang hidup as a way to resist geothermal, which again they feel is a form of injustice, right? Kind of perpetuated in the name of green transition, but kind of not equitable. And that's a lack of equity in terms of not just the distributive kind of benefits and risks, but also recognition of justice and procedural justice insofar as they didn't get to participate in the decision making, and in terms of not recognizing sort of their own forms of placemaking and ways of being in the world. Currently, there's a temporary pause on 2 of the projects. The church in Nende has gotten really involved. Our archdiocese has called for this stuff, and so that's what I'll be going to try to learn more about when I go in 2 days. So anyway, so basically what I've been trying to say is whether a proposed solution, whether adaptation or mitigation for climate change is just really can depend on the scale that you're looking at. The nation state scale is very limiting. And that climate change is always, it's a multiplier of other processes. It's always articulated with other processes rather than happening. So I've talked for a really long time and probably a little bit fast, but thank you so much. And let's have it.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. And for me, it's fascinating. It's open eye about how you discuss about, inequality from the, between nations, but within nations. I think that is the key that has not been discussed so much, in my opinion, in Indonesia. I don't want talking about we and southern nation of with the developed nation. That's one discussion. But how about interact that with the inequality within the nations, right? So I think this is a very fascinating issues. I think this is open our discussion ya. Saya buka diskusi, mudah-mudahan bisa ketangkep ya apa yang dia frame tentang what they call the new agrarian issues ya. Karena sebenarnya ini bicara tentang inequality dan di dalam kalau di saya selalu bicara tentang inequality within nations ya. Dalam Indonesia sendiri ya, tetapi bagaimana debate tentang Indonesia dengan negara-negara barat ya, dengan developed countries. bagaimana itu kita connectkan gitu ya, which is ini menjadi menarik because we are talking about nations ya. Sementara di dalam itu bagaimana yang banyak
Traditional IR.
Oh yes.
Okay, that's great. So that's why we collaborate.
Only focus on it.
Exactly, that's what we can call. Oke, saya buka pertanyaan session. Ya, silakan Mas kenalkan dirinya supaya bisa tahu Mas Sofan.
Thank you very much, Chair Bu Suraya. Thank you very much, Emily. A very interesting presentation. My name is Soft One, the soft one, not the hard one. I'm coming from the Department of International Relations. So as Bu Suraya mentioned, traditionally IR looks at the state level. And actually, your presentation very much speaks and resonates to my own research on palm oil governance. So my first interaction with palm oil governance was actually through the request and discussion from people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about how there is an inequality in shaping the governance on palm oil. And as you already highlighted, the largest contribution of Indonesia to the climate change is from land use change. And the largest contribution for the land use change is coming from the expansion for agricultural purposes, which in year 2000s was contributed by the palm oil industry expansion. So there was a lot of pressures from the developed countries for Indonesia to then ensure that the governance of the palm oil industry is adhering to sustainability standards, which is developed through the North. So there are a lot of complaints from Indonesia, particularly from the producing companies, but also being embedded. This perception has been integrated to the official government position, in which the government then see that these pressures are unfairly, unfairly subjected to producing countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, which are developing countries, while there are others, for example, other rifle vegetable oil, like rapeseed, sunflower seed, soybeans, are not facing similar scrutiny despite even larger impacts on the environment. So that is why the discourse on palm oil in the international negotiations, for example, in the WTO cases, was pretty much this, how to say, framed in this developing divide, where Indonesia framed this as a continuation of the colonial inequality, in which the developed countries attempts to continue the domination towards the colonized people. But as you then you show how then the discourse of inequality at the interstate level is often, how to say, at odds with what is happening inside the country. So it is interesting, for example, to see how then, as part of that resistance, the Indonesian government, with the pressure from the Indonesian palm oil companies, developed its own international, the Indonesian sustainable palm oil standard, the ISPO, which is less stringent and is aimed at providing more, how to say, protection from for the companies towards these more stringent standards from the north. But that means less protections towards the impacts of inequality within the country. So yeah, I mean, your discussion showing how this interstate and intrastate inequalities are often at odds. Now, my question is, how do we get out from this? I mean, there is a trade-off which is pretty clear. I mean, I'm then involved in both the state discourses and also the civil society discourses, and to many extents, they are standing on different conceptualization of climate justice, and they are not talking. And I mean, for example, even the government often perceives, because the local civil societies need to leverage their power against the state, they make transnational advocacy coalition. Because they make transnational advocacy coalition, they are perceived as the foreign agents. I mean, undang-undang ormas, the ormas law, what is it? The civil society organization law was pretty much driven by the activism by the Greenpeace when Greenpeace makes some how to say hard actions against palm oil companies in 2000s, and there are a lot of discourse about Greenpeace and these institutions, these civil society organizations as anti-asing foreign agents. I mean, as somebody who is interacting with both the governments and civil society, I often see that both of them often have like, okay, you have some valid points, but you also have these blind spots. But when you go into the practical thing, it's very difficult because the government, it is true that Indonesia, for example, needs an energy transition. Indonesia, and for that energy transition, Indonesia needs renewable energy projects. But to have these projects implemented, you need to, for example, develop and need space, need resources, etc., which then often at odds with the local communities. So how do we get out from these trade-offs? Thank you.
I'll get another question and then we can thinking about how to answer this. I know that's easy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Nandito, and I'm from Flores.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was in a junior in high school in Mataloco, Bajawa.
Okay.
It's very close with the geothermal project. Yeah. Every night I still remember I see the night
from the public relations.
No. I'm the public relations of the church. Because my school was for the Christian, Catholic Christian, but I got out. Yeah, I still remember every night I see the night of Mataloco red light because of the geothermal project, and I still remember how my teachers always say Flores is not for extractivism. The very simple logic from the many priests that told us that at the time Flores is a very small island. If you dig one hole and it will crack. Yeah, even though it is actually not really rational, but it is very effective for persuading people that no, big no. Actually, I'm and I'm also from Manggarai. My parents, but I was born in Makassar, unfortunately.
Why?
Because I was dislocated with my culture. I even didn't know how to speak Manggarai. So actually, I have 2 points here. Most of one question and one argument. I think the first commentary that I try to engage is the role of one transnational agent, Catholic Church. I think it's I think after the Pope Francis rule, and yeah, there's a very big change. But actually, if we look carefully at the local level, it is not always the church is not always there. There is also contestation. Yeah, in one time they advocate in Flores, for example. One time they advocate geothermal project, but in another time in Maumere, for example, they built factories with a ridiculous name, Christus Raja Momeret, the house.
That's the king.
Yeah, yesterday we have that.
Yeah, but in Papua, they support national project like food estate. So I think
Yeah.
if we it will be a very interesting point to really understand at one time and in one at what conditions at what conditions church become our allies. Yeah, and that's a very crucial questions for the civil society movements. That's the first one. The second one is I think if Mas Sofan asked about how do we get out of this, I'm just curious about I'm in positions where I don't really believe in state mediation. But it doesn't mean I don't think we should stay away from state. I still think we should take power from the elites. But what I'm curious is what is the effective way for the civil society, the customary adat masyarakat indigenous society to mobilize themselves. I think Manggarai, Flores, I think they are pretty much helped by church to voice their concerns, and their voice become national because church has a national and even transnational networks. But up to the present, it is yes, it is effective, but in one part, they still. I don't think we can always rely on that ambiguous institutions, and what kind of method that we can effectively use to stand against the church and not the church, sorry, the state and the corporates, because well, I think maybe we can learn from another part of the world, and maybe your research have shown some examples, and because waiting for the state to mediate, waiting for any transnational institutions, I don't think they really understand the dynamic within the society. That's become one of my biggest questions. What is the effective method? Whether is it violence or non-violence? Yeah, if we need violence, yeah, we can go. And I just yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Should I?
Terima kasih. Yes,
Okay.
please.
Those are both big, really hard questions. So let me start with the second one, and just a riff on a few points. So I should make clear that the work I'm doing in Flores is together with a couple of scholar activists from Flores, so Cypri Dale and Greg Appy, who are with Manggarai as well. And so I'm very new to the Indonesian context, and so a lot of what I learned is from them. In terms of the church, I know that the MPIC SVB has played a really important role. I also know that in Waisano, and look, originally, there was a bishop who had opposed and then agreed and told Jokowi that he was okay, and then villagers got very upset. And so last year when I went with Cypri and Greg in Boulder, they were actually writing a letter together to the bishop to sort of say, hey, if you care about us, you should propose the proposal. So I'm aware that it is quite complicated, and in Papua as well. There was something I was going to say. Okay. So I mean, I don't. Of course, you all will be better able to answer the question of what to do in Indonesia than me. I mean, it is interesting to me coming to learn about Indonesia from China, where despite all of the many problems, it feels more hopeful to me because there is a civil society here. And that civil society has really been effectively kind of cut off in China with the intense authoritarian, you know, that one doesn't find the kind of scholar activism that we see here. Just in terms of China too, there's very effective deployment of this politics of suspicion with Tibet in particular. They not only can they not jump scale to work with people in other countries, but any, like for Tibetans in particular, the questions of sovereignty, any kind of like, they can't receive any money, any kind of contact with Tibetans and people outside are often viewed with suspicion. So, so not an answer, but to say that there does still seem to be, you know, more space here to sort of mobilize and work with allies in the country, the network, and outside. In terms of, you know, in terms of Mongarai, what is kind of interesting, it's obviously not a permanent solution, but they've been able to stop the funding from both the World Bank and the KfW for now. And they've done this by arguing that there has not been free prior consent. And so they've positioned themselves essentially as, you know, with this idea of Guangido, which is the translation of other Mongarai concepts. They have worked like with Sun Spirit and Floresa, invited people from the World Bank to go, invited people from KfW to go and visit their village. And in both cases, like the World Bank's original documents had said, there are no indigenous peoples here. And then later, after quite a lot of direct letter writing and telling people from the World Bank to come, the reports from the World Bank say there are indigenous peoples here, and FPIC was not followed. And so the World Bank has pulled out. Of course, the Indonesian government says, okay, no World Bank, we'll fund it ourselves. And so, you know, it's not over. But with KfW as well, it's temporarily suspended. It's also tricky because within each of these communities, there's pro and con too, right? And so you have these like this manipulation of the pro within the community. So I don't have an answer, but just to say that at least temporarily the activism you know, has at least temporarily blocked through this positioning. In terms of what to do about yeah, I mean, I don't quite know what to say. I do think the strategy of jumping scale seems, you know, for, you know, moving beyond the nation state scale of transnational activism, where it still seems successful to me right now seems more like in Latin America, like, but I feel like in countries which are experiencing this authoritarian turn, including particularly in China, right? If that becomes a really dangerous strategy, as Sofan said, where when you position yourselves with foreign actors, then it is seen with suspicion. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Which of you? I mean, I feel like in our own way, we're sort of facing this in the United States too, right? Where like indigenous water protectors protesting against pipelines. You know, it was really their fight, but the government is using that as a way to try to bankrupt Greenpeace in the US, saying that Greenpeace was responsible, and there was just a judgment. They owe like $30 million or something. So I think we see these sorts of tactics in many cases, and yeah, in terms of the yeah, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer.
No, that is a very difficult question.
Yeah.
But is there any role academics you see? Because you know, in Indonesia or I know in other places, sometimes academic has a strict divided, I'm academic, you're, do you see in other, place that is, what is the role of academics? Is
I mean,
there
I
any
think,
role?
no, absolutely. I think in China, there is no role because the government has really limited that. I think in the US, I feel like in Indonesia, I do think academics can play an important role in legitimacy in some ways, right? To the extent that scholarship is still seen as a kind of legitimate. I think teaching students about it, climate change and climate justice is really important. But I also think that academics, in the US, there's quite a lot of attention now to like how to work with indigenous or marginalized peoples. It's slow, you have to build relationships foremost, but sort of working with them to identify the problems that they want researched. I think academics can mobilize resources that are helpful for communities. So I do think doing research with communities and for communities can be very empowering for them. I remember one thing I was going to say about some of the many conundrums that someone mentioned. So last year I did attend. There's some scholars at UGM who got some funding and brought together a whole group of anti-geothermal activists. And, they were able to use funding to fund these activists to work on some of their community activities, to also kind of collect narratives from people in their own communities. They're going to publish something together. I was really impressed. They were very, very attentive to like who owns the data. It is the activist. It is not UGM. And who has the right to publish what. And so it's a very they have sovereignty over the data they collect, and the scholars are kind of acting as true collaborators in that sense. On the other hand, of course, I wanted to go to their meeting. They were very suspicious of me, and the very first thing they asked was "What is your stance on geothermal?" And I said, "I think it works in some places like Iceland, where there are actually no indigenous people there because of the history, and it's really kind of there's problems there too. Like they use their geothermal to power all these other kind of terrible polluting industries, but I think the geothermal itself works well, and they did not want to hear that. They were very angry because they didn't want to hear that geothermal can ever work anywhere because they felt that this created an opening for geothermal in Indonesia, right? Even though I think the issue is the participatory prevention and the process. So that was an interesting point of tension to me, and sort of speaks to this kind of tension you're talking about.
Can I jump?
Yeah.
Because that's exactly my observations on the role of civil society organizations. Like government, civil society organizations, and actually I have mine here.
Okay.
Sorry, I forgot to use it. Like government, civil society organizations, and academia also operate in different scales.
I think that's all.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. It wasn't.
I forgot my idea. I can if I go to Flores right now, I cannot be labeled as local scholars, right? And I cannot even be labeled as locals.
Yeah.
I bring my own knowledge to observe the local situation, and then it's the same. Like civil society organizations, there are regional level CSO, local level CSO, national level CSO, and they got funding from international philanthropists or whatever international NGO as well. And like the governments, we might also create certain level of injustices while dealing with the local communities or indigenous communities, right? And that so in response to your questions, So by proposing, I mean, by imagining that the only possible idea is to resist might also create injustice to certain member of local communities, in my understanding, in my opinion. So this is kind of a delicate matters that consists of different tensions at different scales, right? So, but of course, national governments really want to see result, really want to see whatever new infrastructure built, new power supply, and so they need to quick in it has to be fast, it has to be quick, it has to create result in tangible result as soon as possible. And that's, I think, the role of academia is to always unpack these tensions, because I myself as an academic, I'm not really comfortable if someone asks me then what should we do, because maybe we haven't finished unpack the complexities, but maybe that's also an excuse for us not to contribute. So yeah, this is like the real tension in social science, I guess.
Yes.
But yeah, thanks for your presentations. You make me realize that these countries have a lot of problems. Well, it was just last week when civil society declared one civil society organizations declare we won the resistance against the governments about the mining in Raja Ampat.
Raja Ampat, yes.
Premature declarations, in my opinion, but still, Greenpeace declared it as we won. We finally prevent the governments from continuing explorations in Raja Ampat, and then this matter, although it's already been happening for quite some time, but still, another new problems with eastern part of Indonesia once again. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Can I share a little bit about this? Yesterday, there is a meeting from Bapenas. It's actually work with another NGO, with the Kemitraan. And in the program of conclusion, this is important because at the beginning they, Bapenas against to have me and representative of the indigenous youth. Yeah? But finally, the Kemitraan is the NGO that worked with the Bapenas able to convince them. And this is interesting because what Bapenas want to do is actually, this meeting about kick off penyusunan peta jalan pemenuhan hak, perlindungan, dan pemberdayaan masyarakat padat. So my argument at the time is actually about citizenship. So I introduced issue that, okay, we have conflict of interest, like you say, like everybody says, right? But what is the role of the states to actually acknowledging every citizen have rights? And so I said to the Bapenas, this is a role of the state to acknowledge different value, different interest, different impact. And I actually promote to unpack or to increase this debate about citizens' rights and to open about process of conflict resolutions, about discussion. Otherwise, are we going to have a war or we want to discuss in peace? So that is the role. I promote that issue and Bapenas, this is, so I actually, I think, I said to them, if we able to, talk about peta jalan, yeah, the roadmap, to bring every voice and provide mechanism to talk about this. And this has become, an example in Indonesia. So sometimes we have to make the government, proud about, that idea, although this is not easy, right? As you mentioned, and everybody mentioned, I think everybody see it, it's not easy. But the question is in the government, what is the role of the government to basically acknowledge based on citizens' rights? And this is something that I want to focus Kemitraan as an NGO to, actually push this. So we'll see how the Bappenas able to open the dialogue and open it, very poised. I said this will not be solved in 1 year, but if this is a place for fundamental discussions and build mechanism, I think this is a good example. Because in my opinion, everyone starts with fail or with bersalah, Rockefeller, Foundation, but they shift. So I'm interested in understanding how you shift from, is all this, example and human rights violation to more, decent dialogue without war, but, of course, put everyone in the table. Now, I think this is something that, for me, we have to push that on the table, even though it's difficult. So yesterday is very interesting to see that, Daniel.
Just in response to the intervention here, I mean, when there was a question earlier about what is the role of academia, I was really talking about a lot of scholarship that's been done in geography and anthropology about working with communities and prioritizing community goals and having a community led. But I do agree. There's also I do believe in the value of the critical analytical lens. Because policy at the end of the day is based on something, right? And we need to provide that. And I say that from a context where scholarship is very much just under attack in the United States, right? Like our National Science Foundation just got kicked out of their building and they, so there's all sorts of depredations. And I think we are, at least in the US, in a place where we just have to value forward the value of knowledge itself to critical analysis as well.
Yeah, thank you. Kita satu kali lagi ya, Prof. Ya. Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Leo. I'm a freelance researcher. I don't know in Uni. I didn't even graduate from here, so I'm outside right now.
That's okay.
Okay. I want to. My response is respond to the discussion previously. That I think there's one thing that stood up is how. First of all, from your presentation, is how the countries frame the issue of the climate justice. For example, some countries just want to frame it as a human rights issue, and I think it's also happening in Indonesia that even in indigenous level, it's not framed into like environmental or climate issue even, but into like something more simplistic or something more of politics. Either it's poverty, and it's economic problems, those kind of low politics issues. And that's also because I think, in my opinion, because I did write a paper for an upcoming conference. Let's talk about this, the difficulty about science communication regarding climate science. Then, okay, maybe everyone in this room is educated enough to understand what is climate change, what is climate justice, what it's net zero means. But if you go outside to Jakarta, stop someone and ask what is net zero means, probably they don't know. And I did meet a pejabat from Bapenas also in science discussion a few months ago. When I asked about net zero, he actually say that that it's impossible for us to be net zero because we produce carbons.
Mhm.
That means he doesn't understand what net zero means. As it, or from a communication standpoint, net zero itself is a good branding. Everyone maybe knows what net zero is, but the essence of net zero lost in translation. And that is not if it's important that it's lost to the general public, but also to the people who the important people who actually need to know what they're doing, who the policymakers. So yeah, I think maybe the first of all is about the framing of the issue, and then they fail to frame because there is disparity of the knowledge, and maybe that's the role of academia. But then again, there's this division of the ivory tower, and the people because again, climate change is a very hard topic to water down without making it lost context. Thank you.
Absolutely. Correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Emily and Bu Suraya. Maybe I want to elaborate a little bit from Mas Sofwan and Kak Yiri questions. So, Professor Emily, on your presentation, you're going to forest to observe the geothermal energy. So, in Indonesia, as a developing country, we have limited option on the development of renewable energy. So, in one side, we still being exploited for nickel in the solar PV supply chain. So sometimes we didn't have the choice not to mine, and in the context of maybe Weda and Morowali, the local people also get economic opportunity. They didn't have to come to Jakarta, they didn't have to come to Manado to search for decent work. They are paid very large sum of money and it is like 8 million for the entry level jobs in nickel mining. Besides, our minimum wage is still 5 million. So there is still a failure of the government to provide decent work to these people. And sometimes it is the failure of government that they promote the work and the job, even though it's not green. I don't know, it's debatable whether it's green or brown or it's debatable for us. But sometimes we didn't have any choice because the demand is there. The global demand is there from China, even though in the supply chain, we know that the quality of the nickel is still for stainless steel and not for the battery. So we are trying to push to upgrade and to scale up our position in the supply chain, but we know that we didn't have many choice to have R&D infrastructure and etc. And maybe sometimes besides, it's not that I feel that indigenous population is not important, but maybe when we see different perspective from the workforce, the labor force, and we still have some kind of gray area. So beside of nickel industry, for example, we want to transition the coal workforce to solar PV workforce, and then but still in the national plan of LPPSP, we still are planning to add some more coal power plant, and it is very uncertain time for us. So we are as academia still have some doubts even when we are typing and we're researching. So do you have any perspective about the some labor force transitioning?
So that's a lot. So let me try to answer the second one first, and then I'll talk about science communication. I mean, I haven't studied nickel, but you mentioned geothermal, so I'll just say that in terms of geothermal, there's not a lot of labor. It's very different from mining. Once you build a plant, there's really not much for people to do. So in Ende, there's a geothermal plant there, but there's really only two there's a couple technical people. The local people were promised jobs, but what they have is they are just guards and they don't make a lot of money. And so the communities that are resisting, the communities like in Waisano and in Monterey that are resisting are saying, you know, they've been integrated into the cash economy for a long time, and they're sort of saying, we have our cash crops and they're a decent enough living, and we would like, and out-migration is a big problem, and they're like, we would like tourism, we would like things that can keep our community here, but we don't want something that's going to ruin our crops because those are giving us a decent living. In terms of, you know, and I know I'm not talking about nickel because really I'm not, you know, informed enough to say much about it. In terms of, like we, you know, like I do think diesel is not a good, it's not a good solution. It's very dirty. It's very expensive because they import it all from somewhere else. So, and here's, this speaks to the earlier question about the tension, right, between sometimes activists and scholars. Like, I do think we need some sort of geothermal somewhere. It's useful because it's a base load power, right, unlike solar and wind, which is power. So there are some technical reasons to have it. But again, I think from the perspective of local communities, they're sort of saying, this is just going to build more big resorts in Labuan Bajo that makes our lives more difficult and takes away our land. So why should we be doing that, right? And I think that's sort of the political economy is the pros and the problem. I don't have a solution to that, but I know, you know, in terms of building more coal-fired power plants, it's probably because of who owns, right? Like which leaders own and have interest in, right? And that's, I think, where the crux of the problem. Yeah, I mean, I think in the US, you know, and this kind of bridges into one of the labor, we had proposals for what they were calling the Green New Deal, and the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which Trump is now gutting, was about creating new jobs in manufacturing for the renewable section. And I think in terms of the question about like how to make this palatable to ordinary people, I mean, science communication is a huge problem in the US. We have supposedly well-educated people who say they don't believe in climate change. Yeah, I mean, now there's all these, like a different project I'm working on is on conspiracy theories. There are so many conspiracy theories in the United States now about like the government can, like they don't believe in climate change, but they believe the government can control the weather. You know, it's all sorts of, you know, and so it's become this sort of ideological, political, identity-based thing that is really eviscerating any kind of belief in science, which is a really, really big issue we have. So people in the US don't really understand climate. A lot of people don't understand climate change, or they understand it, but they say it's not real because their identity is wrapped up in that. But I do think there are policies where it can be about, you know, green economy, it can be about remediation, restoration, right? The government could invest in this. I mean, in terms of net zero, you know, one could argue that they're not wrong that net zero is kind of a stupid thing, right? What we need is actually zero, right? Not net zero, because a lot of the net depends on carbon capture, which is also presents all sorts of problems. It's very expensive. It's not proven. The geology is not well known. You know, and I think what all of this speaks to is a really big problem that I don't have any kind of answer to. But you know, what we need is fewer EVs and more public transportation, right? At least. And that is going to require some sort of change that it's very hard to do right now in the political situation that we're in.
Oke, terakhir ya.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Bao, coming from Xiamen University in China. I'd like to answer a question you mentioned in your presentation. That is China still a developing country? So my answer is yes, because we can get the answer from your presentation. because China is still suffering from the climate change. And I think this, whether it vulnerable to climate change, is a significant distinction between developing country and developed country. And China is considered as the world's biggest factory. That means there are lots of low-end industry in China. And the low-end industry will make the developing country do it. And the high technology industry will let the developed country do it. I think this is the kind of climate injustice. And we just emphasize the carbon emission by developing countries today. By mentioned the carbon emission in history by developed countries is another kind of climate injustice. The transition to the new energy based economy will be the primary path to deal with the climate injustice. But it faces lots of challenge. I think the biggest challenge is the economization or the politicization of climate change. For example, in Malaysia, there are lots of abundant of the gasoline. The gasoline vehicle is more cheaper than the electric vehicles. And in China, China's new energy vehicle policy is contained by US and Europe. So this leads a view in China that is the climate change or the climate issue, climate justice is just a kind of political narrative, a political tool, or even a political movement. So my question is, how do you view the economization and politicization of climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. If you remember, the first few slides I started with were about cumulative emissions, and I showed that the US far exceeds China in cumulative emissions. So I agree with your point. I will never defend anything the US does on an international policy. I think the containment of the EVs is terrible. I think US policy towards China is awful. So I agree in those terms. I will say that Xi Jinping is a much bigger defender of action on climate change than stupid orangutan Trump, right? So I agree with you. That said, in terms of, I don't think climate vulnerability is a good mark of a developing of what is a developed or developing country. There are many people in the US, Native Americans are extremely vulnerable to climate change. There are many Native Americans who today do not have electricity, do not have running water, right? And so, and there are many people died from heat stress during, every summer as it gets hotter. So there are many people who are subject to premature death in the United States as well. That doesn't make the US a developing country. It just makes the US an unequal country. China is climbing up the production ladder. It is no longer the factory of the world the way it was. It is many, goods have moved to Bangladesh, like a lot of they moved to Bangladesh, they moved to Vietnam. All right, China is definitely climbing up that ladder now. But we have many Chinese grad students in our department. And when they come to where I live in Boulder, they're like, this is not a developed country. So that's a little bit of a joke, right?
Yes.
So that's a joke, but it does represent the view, right, of many people in the global south, small island developing states, you look at a country like Nepal or Bangladesh, they see, or Bhutan, right? They see China as quite well. So, you know, again, I completely agree that the US is a terrible, horrible actor and on the global stage in terms of climate, in terms of its China policy, in terms of, but that doesn't, none of that horror of the Trump regime and previous administrations means that climate change doesn't exist and isn't going to affect the most vulnerable in every single country. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think this is a very good discussion because although we can argue about who are the nations that are most developed or undeveloped, that is my experience also in the United States. United States is not equal society, it's inequality. But the problem that Southern see United States as rich and things, the gap between the rich and the poor are big. So that's the reason I never make the country north and south, but as a rich oligarch and the poor. And yes, every country has that. Inequality in each country, that is the problem. So, I'm privileged to study 10 years in the United States to see this. So I never see in the United States every society equal. And including in Indonesia. I never been to China. But that is the issue. So I think it's very interesting to discuss this with somebody that from United States, but also see the different inequality in different nations. I think this is something that encouraging for me. But anyway, this discussion is not to try what is the best solution.
Yeah.
So I think this is the role of us to look at the best solutions and to address importantly about inequality. And I promote the discussion that next on the 2nd July webinar. And this is something that I will address, right? So I'm not against the Hilirisasi, but I'm against the inequality. So I think this is something that we have to, talk more about inequality in every country, and including Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Emily, thank you very much. Terima kasih juga untuk semua yang hadir pada hari ini. It's productive, and I hope after this we can collaborate more about this, the next, research.
I think we forgot to thank those who.
Oh yeah,
Sorry, I unfortunately.
Yeah.
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 Thank you for how many?
Digital inequality.
Oh, thank you for people that also attend the Zoom meeting. I'm sorry that we are not collect that there's somebody that may be asking the questions. I'm a bad moderator. Sorry.
It's part of procedural injustice.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for not giving the one who attend the Zoom to also ask me questions. But I think this is something that we could, discuss more again, and thank you for collaboration with the ER. I think this is very productive, and we can, continue our collaboration in the future. Terima kasih banyak, and
Thank you.
thank you very much.